Hello, welcome. Welcome, everybody. You are listening to the Pure Strategies Conversations webinar series. We are so excited to offer these unique discussions to help you transform your business to create a more sustainable future. I'm Melanie Fleming, Marketing Manager for Pure Strategies. Our team provides sustainability consulting to companies looking to develop goals, enhance their sustainability programs, and implement changes in their products, packaging, and supply chains. We are offering these webinars to help companies advance their environmental and social performance in their business, helping to show you the possibilities for change and empower you with insights from those at the very forefront. You can find our past webinars, research reports, and resources on our website, purestrategies.com, including information about work we have done for Seventh Generation, Walmart, Ben & Jerry's, and other known sustainability leaders. Your host today, Tim Greiner, is Managing Director of Pure Strategies and co-founder of Pure Strategies and the Chemical Footprint Project. He has been providing custom sustainability solutions to corporate clients for over 20 years. During this 30-minute webinar, Tim will be talking with Mark Rossi, Executive Director, Clean Production Action. Mark is co-creator of Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, a globally recognized chemical hazard assessment method used by governments and businesses in the electronics, apparel, and building sectors to help identify safer alternatives to toxic chemicals. Mark is also co-founder of the Chemical Footprint Project, a first-of-its-kind initiative to quantitatively measure chemical footprints and benchmark chemicals management performance. He is the founder of BizNGO, a collaborative of businesses, NGOs, and governments that work together to create solutions for safer chemicals and sustainable materials. Today, Tim and Mark will discuss how companies can make progress towards safer materials, the scope of the problem of hazardous chemicals in commerce, and what companies should be doing to progress on material health. We aim to have time at the end of their conversation to cover your questions. The audience will be muted, so please provide your questions in the Q&A field. I will ask as many questions as time will allow. The recording of this session will also be posted on the Pure Strategies website. And now I'd like to hand it off to Tim.
Thank you, Melanie. Appreciate the introduction, and welcome, Mark. It's great to have you here today. I'm really excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it all week, and delighted to have the time to speak with you about your work in bringing material health across industries, across sectors, and really driving material health into corporate strategy and practices used by companies. So thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here with you, Tim. I feel like I'm at a fireside chat with you.
No fire today. It's warm enough. And I feel like I'm like in the Maine woods with you today.
And you are.
So maybe to kick us off, one of the things that I really like to do when I think about the kinds of problems that the work that you're doing within Clean Production Action is trying to address, is to really step back and think about why chemicals, why hazardous chemicals. Like what's the scale of the problem? We hear about climate change all the time, right? But we think also about like the personal impacts on our bodies and the impacts on our families on hazardous chemicals. What's the scale of the problem that we're facing?
Yeah, Tim. Well, of course, it's a huge scale, but like, how do we get our arms around it and think about it? And so, I'm going to sort of bring up two frames for thinking about the problem of chemicals. So one is persistence, and then two is endocrine disrupting compounds. Because I want to bring them up for two really different but really important reasons. So one on the persistence issue is, right, chemicals that get out into the environment are going to be there for a long time, right? That they're very slow to break down. And right now, we're dealing with two chemistries that are significant issues for persistence. So one are the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, right? The PFAS. And two are plastics. And so I want to sort of come back to, related to both of those, right? PFAS either are very persistent themselves, right? Half-lives sometimes in the thousands of years, right? So essentially they don't break down, or they break down into the persistent compounds. And so what that means, once these chemicals are out in the environment, they're everywhere. And PFAS are now, they're in the environment, and they're also very mobile. So they get into soil and they actually move through the soil into groundwater, into drinking water. And then because they're persistent, they're everywhere. So basically it's almost impossible to find an American, increasingly hard to find anybody in the world, right, that does not have PFAS chemicals in them. And that's people and the ecosystem. And then plastics are a really interesting one, right? Because like we tend not to think of them as a chemical, but for a long time, I've been thinking about plastics and their persistence issue, right? They're there, they get out into the environment, and then they're able to exert any adverse health effects as they get into the environment. So you've got this persistence issue and increasingly mobility. So if you haven't heard of PFAS, they're coming, they're an issue. The EU is setting up a framework to regulate PFAS chemicals and eliminate them as a class. The other is endocrine disrupting compounds are a really interesting set of compounds, because what they're doing is they're getting in and they're mucking around in our endocrine systems. And one of the things that really matters about that is that small amounts really matter, because they get in and they turn on and off the endocrine system, hormones at very, very small levels, right? Parts per trillion, parts per billion, right? Small amounts where we typically think, oh, well, right, it's the dose that matters. But in this case, it's the timing that matters when it gets into the body and it is able to exert this adverse effect. And so now, like if you have, right, if PFAS, for example, are endocrine disrupting compounds, they're spread all over the world. We're all exposed to them, and they're able to exert these effects at certain specific times in our lives. And so one of the emerging thoughts around the endocrine disrupting compounds is, right, they're causing adverse health effects to our reproductive and developmental systems. And there's this new book out called Countdown by Shayna Swan that looks at the declining sperm counts. And over the past 40 years, sperm counts in the developed countries have declined by over 50%. And so, right, how many of us know couples that have had a hard time conceiving, right? And that's part of this issue, is that we're all now carrying these endocrine disrupting compounds. They're getting in, they're mucking up our hormone system, and declining sperm counts, infertility are some of the outcomes of that.
Oh, that's sobering. To think of the persistence issue combined with endocrine disruption, and that simple fact, scary fact that fertility is declining in developed countries at that level. I mean, that's unbelievable. And I assume it's not just, these are examples, right, of of multiple problems associated with chemicals, right? The more traditional ones being cancer, let's say, right, or a neurotoxin of some kind. But here we're talking also about things that are systemic and pass generation to generation.
Well, exactly. There's been a lot of work around carcinogens, chemicals that can cause cancer over the years. And right, this is more, right, the emerging science issues to be taken account of. When we look at what regulatory agencies restrict chemicals on, it's cancer, it's mutagenicity, it's reproductive developmental toxicity, neurotoxicity. Now these endocrine disrupting compounds, but also there's this combination of persistence, bioaccumulation, right, ability to accumulate in the environment, and toxicity. So we've estimated, and just in terms of chemicals and chemical classes, right, there's over 2,000 identified chemicals that we've identified through Green Screen that fit those categories as chemicals of high concern, right? So, and that's chemicals and chemical classes. PFAS itself is a class of 5,000 chemicals. So as we think about like getting ahead of the curve for companies, it's really thinking about these chemical classes. Where are they in your products and supply chains, and thinking about how to move away from chemical classes to safer chemistries and alternatives.
So I want to talk about that movement, like how to accomplish that, but just go back a little bit, because it seems to me from a regulatory standpoint, like you would think, oh, these are big issues, the regulatory system is going to manage it. But what I've always observed is regulations are 10 to 15 years behind the identification of the problem. Like they're very slow to catch up. And then maybe they don't completely cover off on the issues. We still have exposure to chemicals that have been in commerce for a long time, and the regulatory agencies haven't caught up. Could you just talk a little bit about, the failure of the regulatory system and why corporate action is so important?
Yeah, so I mean, one way of like thinking of regulations, right, is a lagging indicator, right? Regulations are not a leading indicator of action. And what's happened also because of the political environment in the US is also increasingly a laggard in the regulatory space. So first off, regulations in general are a lagging indicator in terms of addressing chemicals and chemicals of concern. And then the US is significantly behind that curve. So going back to the PFAS chemicals, there was just an article in the Guardian newspaper that the 7 manufacturers of PFAS over the past 2 years have spent $61 million in the US in terms of lobbying at the federal level to avoid regulations around chemicals, right? So the power of the vested industry and the incumbent chemistry is really huge, really protective of its current products, right? And so you see that here, you see that in Europe as well. I mean, Europe is doing a little bit better, right, in terms of being out ahead and trying to take action. But if you then look at, well, where are consumers at? Where are advocacy organizations at? Where are leading best practices in companies? They're way far ahead of regulatory compliance. So to say that you're in regulatory compliance is just to say we are doing the most basic amount of work in terms of managing our chemicals.
Or as Bill McDonough says, you're polluting up to the maximum extent allowed by law.
Exactly.
When you're meeting compliance, yeah. So let's talk about then like the corporate initiative. So many companies are taking aggressive, proactive action on dealing with these chemicals of concern, promoting material health. So, it's not, my understanding from having worked with businesses that are doing this, it's an important project. It's a difficult thing to do, and there's a number of challenges. Could you walk us through some of the challenges that companies face as they try to push down this path?
Yeah, and I'm going to use both like the challenges and the solutions frame by stepping back to the BizNGO Principles for Safer Chemicals, which we created in 2007. You were part of that work, Tim. But so our first principle is know and disclose. Second is assess and avoid hazards. The third is commit to continuous improvement. And then the fourth is engage in standards and policies to advance the above 3 principles. But I toss those out because they really do reflect both the challenges and the solutions. So if we take that first one, which is know product chemistry, and you think of know product chemistry in products and supply chains, this is just a huge challenge for many organizations. So we, in our certification work, increasingly are engaging companies and saying, okay, to certify your product to green screen criteria, you have to know all the chemical ingredient information and disclose it to us or another verifying body. And frequently, right, companies just don't have that data. And especially if you make articles, right, all the products around that we're sitting around our desks, right, the companies just don't know what's in those products. And then you have to go up the supply chain, multiple levels to try and get at that information, right? So you then, if you don't know what's in this plastic that's on your keyboard, how are you going to know, right, if PFAS chemicals are there, right? So So the only way to really get out ahead of regulations in this space is to have the knowledge of what's in the products. Increasingly, there's concerns about what's going on in your manufacturing operations of your suppliers. So that's another level. So there is then, right, another challenge to this is the corporate level commitment, right? So this is all around not gathering the data and having the knowledge and extracting this information from your supply chain. So that takes, right, a huge amount of effort, and companies then need to have that senior management leadership, right? Because without that leadership, there's not going to be the investment in going in, investing human resources and technical resources to get the data, to manage the data, and then to take action on the data, right? Because like, as you go like, okay, now I found PFAS, now I have to go and find alternatives, right? And alternatives that perform sufficiently to make a substitution, right? And all that substitution work that has to happen.
Right.
So that within the business principles, that really sits within this continuous improvement level, like, because what's that level of engagement of senior management in supporting this work? Because without it, as you confront challenges in this process and resistance from suppliers, resistance from the incumbent chemistries and materials, you're going to get a lot of resistance. And so you really do need that support internally. And I'll just say, the other part of that challenge is then, right, the assessment and avoiding of hazards, right? So you need to then collect all that information and then have to understand the hazard characteristics, or where's my chemicals of concern. And then you have to prioritize those, right? And say, okay, now I'm going to go look at safer alternatives. So it's a whole interconnected set of work that, Tim, that we've been on this journey on, and that we really articulated in the Chemical Footprint Project of laying out that roadmap to how to address those challenges. And that Chemical Footprint Project survey really gets in there and extracts all those steps that are needed to go from just the first steps beyond compliance to being a real expert in this space.
Well, that's a good point. Let's turn to the Chemical Footprint Project then, because it's a tool, if you will, that can guide companies on the journey, right? So it builds on those 4 principles that you talked about of the BizNGO. And I remember it's now 7 years ago or 8 years ago when we first started meeting and talking about putting together the Chemical Footprint Project. And our vision was really just that, to create a path for companies and to recognize and in a sense reward companies who are on the leading edge of understanding the impacts of chemistry in their products and then reducing those impacts. So could you maybe, for those folks who aren't that aware of CFP, just give us a brief overview, but I think it would be great. I know that the results from last year's survey recently came out, so maybe just give us a high level couple of points about what came out of last year's survey as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we really worked at in the survey is to create this set of steps, because we recognize, right, if you're at compliance, going to, the next step really takes a lot of work. And this is one thing, as I was thinking about, our conversation today, Tim, it's just, for companies, it's just so important to start somewhere. It really doesn't matter where you start. And there's many different places where companies start. But so when we created the survey, we created these 4 key pillars that align up with the BizNGO principles. But 1 is around management strategy, 2 is chemical inventory, 3 is footprint measurement, and 4 is disclosure and verification. Mm-hmm. And where we see companies really getting started is in those first 2 pillars of management strategy and inventory, right? So either it's really starting with what's your corporate chemicals policy, which is, if you can get that, that's really great, because then you do have corporate engagement in that process. Or there's turning to the chemical inventory. And a lot of companies are even starting, right, with what's your restricted substance list. So beyond regulatory compliance, what chemicals of concern are we prioritizing in terms of our purchases or our manufacturing operations? So the RSL, that restricted substance list space, is a real those two spaces are where organizations start. And then, it's interesting as you then start to get out, the footprint measurement is the harder part because you can't measure footprint and reduce that footprint without knowing, right, where are those chemicals, what are those chemicals
You need that full inventory.
And then disclosure, it's always, well, when we wrote the BizNGO principles, the one verb that took the longest to address was the verb disclose, know and disclose, and continues to be a real challenging space for companies to share where they're at on the journey. And I think that's why people want to be able to demonstrate successes and achievements versus where I'm at in terms of, right, my training to get to the finish line or get to that mountain peak and the next mountain peak. So, right, the disclosure side turns out to be a real challenging side, like even disclosing what my chemicals management policy is, disclosing my restricted substance list. But I think, increasingly investors, customers, both business to business customers and consumers, right, want to know where companies are at in the journey and want that level of transparency. So that transparency space really is the hardest, and we see that consistently. It's a really challenging space to get to, but that's something where people, the buyers, your customers want to know, where are you at on this journey?
Great. So starting with that management strategy and inventory, moving towards actually quantifying footprint reductions, and then disclosing progress. Well, who are the leaders? Like, I know there's a number of great companies that have been in the Chemical Footprint Project over the years. Who are the companies that are standing out that are really, and I'm sure you'd love to name all the companies that participated in CFP, not just, because anybody who's participating in that project really is a leader, but maybe you could just pick a couple of companies from a few sectors that folks could, look at if they're interested in learning more about what leadership looks like.
Yeah, taking just three sectors that pop up. So one is the household and personal care products. I mean, in this past year's survey, Seventh Generation scored at the top, as well did RB, Reckitt Benckiser. In electronics, you have HP has been really taking a lead role in reporting where they're at on the journey and taking a lot of action. And also then in the furniture sector, Herman Miller in institutional furnitures, and also Naturepedic, a small manufacturer. And so what's really interesting about that segment of companies that I just highlighted is you have this mixture of companies making articles and formulated products. You have a mixture of small, innovative companies, as well as large, established companies that are taking this action. And I think, like with all of those companies, what's interesting is they've really moved beyond an individual champion for this work, and the work is institutionalized into the organization. And that is just a real critical element. I mean, I work a lot, been working a lot with companies over the past 20 years, and I see this a lot where you have an inspirational change agent in the company who really advances this work, and then that person leaves, and then that institutional knowledge and that energy for keeping this ball rolling dissipates in the organization. And this happens in very large organizations. So I think, like all the organizations I just mentioned, it's either in the DNA of the company or it's become part of the DNA of the company because of organizational investment in this. It's now no longer held by one person, it's held by many people. And that's critical, right, in the large organizations to sustain this over time. And you have to, like, if you don't sustain it over time, then, right, it's just a little bit of success and then it drops off. But if you start this investment, you want to capture the return on that investment over time.
Yeah, building it into the business processes is critical. And I'm going to save a question to the end of our time together around like corporate commitments. So, but before, I mean, I think this is, we could talk all day on this. This is fascinating, but I know folks that are listening in and watching want to ask a few questions as well. So maybe I'll just invite Melanie if there's any questions that you wanted to ask of Mark or myself. That'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. As you said, very interesting conversation, and we have received some really great questions, some really specific questions. I'll start with this one. I think this one is for you, Mark. Well, first it starts out with thanks for doing this work and having this public conversation. How do we put an accurate price on persistence and toxicity / impact?
Wow. There's been research around the impact on human health and the cost of hazardous chemicals to human health, and it's 10% of the global economy. So this is like it's a $1 trillion of impact on the global economy to address these health issues. So I mean, there's a really excellent report that was done looking at just the sort of global impact, and it's called the Global Chemicals Outlook 2 report that really summarizes these key impacts as well as the solutions, both from a policy perspective and a corporate perspective. So the impact is huge. Getting an accurate number is real challenging, but there's an article which I could dig up and send around to you, Melanie, to share that's estimated this cost at like 10% of the global economy.
Great. Thank you so much. A question for you, Tim. What are some of the common hurdles that companies have in addressing chemicals of concern in their products, packaging, and supply chains? And how do companies overcome these?
Yeah, I think Mark touched on some of this. A lot of it is getting the data and information from the supply chain. So challenging for any company, probably more challenging for companies who make articles, little products, right? Because usually in the bill of materials, the chemistry is not specified. It also may be trade secret, or it may be several tiers down in the supply chain, and the company doesn't have visibility to those second or third or fourth tier suppliers. So creating a business process to go and gather that data to, as Mark mentioned earlier, to know what's in the product and then assess where the hazards are once you know. Those are big barriers. Then there's taking action, right? So once we know what's there, we want cost-effective, safe, better substitutes. So, defining what's better and safer, I think, well, CPA's done a lot of work in this area. If you look at green screen, it's probably the best tool or one of the best tools we have to evaluate options around different chemicals. So Melanie, it's that combination. It's knowing, and then once you know, taking action. Those are big barriers for businesses, but barriers that companies have overcome. We've seen companies do it. It's not a one-year project. It's a multi-year effort.
I would add into a couple interesting findings that we're seeing. Well, one is you go to your suppliers and they just give you the safety data sheet. It's just like, getting over that. The safety data sheet is not a chemical ingredient disclosure form. And for folks that don't know about it, there's the health product declaration form is a really great form in the building product sector that's starting to get at this information. And then you've got these certain chemistries that are really challenging. Polymers are really challenging. Certain high-end chemical formulations like adhesives oftentimes are challenging to get that information. And it really is a socialization process of the supply chain, right? That we're not here asking for this information to go and produce that product. We actually want to use this information to help us better understand our chemistry challenges. And one of the fascinating parts of this journey for us around certification has been suppliers are sometimes more likely to give Clean Production Action the data, and I'm sure, Tim, you can find this too in your work, or like Pure Strategies the data, because they know that Clean Production Action and Pure Strategies is not in the business of making polymers, right? So they don't feel so much of a competitive challenge versus giving that to their customer. We find that there's oftentimes a greater hesitancy to share with the customer versus another party.
Well,
Yep.
thank you. I can't believe it, but that's all the time that we really do have for today. Well, we hope that you enjoyed this conversation on how companies can make progress towards sustainable chemistry. A special thank you to Tim and to Mark for your time and your thoughtful insights. We'll be hosting the next Pure Strategies Conversations webinar on May 26th with our guest, Heather Deeth, discussing Lush's ethical sourcing program. Be sure to check our website or sign up for our newsletter for more details on that. The Pure Strategies website has lots of additional resources that might be of use for your work, and feel free to reach out to Tim directly. We look forward to connecting with you again or having you attend another Pure Strategies Conversations webinar in the near future. Stay well, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you,
Thank you,
Tim.
Mel. Thanks, Mark.